In this video, we're going to talk about CSS specificity. Now, I believe that this is one of those things that makes developers hate CSS. But if you know the rules, it's going to be so much easier. Okay, so CSS specificity, what is that all about? Well, when you write CSS, all the CSS selectors has different specificity. You can think of it like a weight or a score maybe. So let's take a look. Let's start with elements. So if you specify your selector with elements or pseudo elements, it's going to get a 1. This is the lowest specificity. Next, we have classes, attributes, and pseudo classes. This is the next level of specificity. Then we have ID. So if you're supplying an ID, that is going to be even higher than classes, even higher than elements. And then we have the biggest specificity, and that is the style tag or inline style. Now, I never use inline styles. I just had a discussion with a colleague. We have a lot of inline style in one of our projects, and I'm saying remove everything, because that is a good ground rule, I think. So inline CSS has the highest specificity, and that means that we can't override it if we specify ID, classes, or elements. It's always going to use the inline styles. Okay, so back up. What is this all about? Well, say that we have the p tag. So the p tag is an element. So that means that the specificity of that selector would be 1. Now let's say that instead we are saying all the p tags directly under a div. Now in this case, how many elements do we have in our selector? We have p and we have div. So that would give us p and div. So now we have 2. So this selector would outrank only p. And we're going to take a look at all of this later on as well. So let's say that we have a class. So we're saying my class. So we can take a look at the slide here and we'll see that, okay, so my class is a class. So that means that the purple square would get a 1. So this is now 10, which outranks both 1 and 2 because this is higher. So what about an ID? So if I have an element that has the ID my section, well, that would give it 100, which of course outranks both classes and elements. So let's say we're using input as a selector. So the input is an element. Great, perfect. But what happens if I add a type equals text? So now we're adding attributes to this as well. And attributes, well, those are in the purple box. So that would give us 11. So the specificity of this selector is 11. Now, then we have the other guy, the important. Now, important overrides everything else, but it doesn't override it on a selector. It overrides it on a specific CSS. And we're going to take a look at that as well. So specificity is one way. The other way is order. The examples that I'm going to show you is in Blazor, but that's just because I'm very familiar with Blazor. It doesn't really matter. This is going to be the same for all frameworks that are using CSS in one way or form. So our example here is a div and a p tag inside of the div. So fairly straightforward when it comes to the HTML. The styles, well, they are empty for now. So let's see what happens. So let's add a p tag. I'm going to add color green to it. And as you can see, the Blazor tag over here, let's zoom in just a little bit, just turned green. So the p tag is now green. So what happens if I copy this and change it to red? You see that it now turns red. If I take the red tag and I move it above instead, you can see that it keeps being green, because that is all about the order. So the order of the CSS matters. In this case, it's going to turn red first and then it's going to turn green. What we also can take a look at is inside of our app component here, we can see that we have our style sheets. Now in this case, the specificity.css up here is at the top. So this is going to load first. All the other CSSs in this file is going to have a later order and therefore have a higher specificity, or at least it's going to be considered later on and override what you already had. So we know that this style is overwritten by this style. But what happens if I add a div up here? It turns red. And that's because this selector now has two elements. So the top one is going to be 0. We got no styles. We got no ID. We're not using classes, but we have two elements. And the same thing goes down here. We have no styles, no ID, no classes, but we do have one element. So now this one has the highest specificity, right? This is the one that we are using. But what would happen if I in here said important? It now turns green. Because it's not the whole section, not the whole style that is going to be rendered obsolete. It is still going to take into account whatever other styles are in here, and it's just going to overwrite the things that are up here. But if I add important, it's going to say, hey, you know what? This is actually important. So I'm going to use this style, the green style. So I'm not going to let any other styles overwrite that because, well, it's important. So this is a good example why you shouldn't use important unless it's absolutely necessary. Because if you do, this specificity just goes out the door. When I was interviewed for my current position, they asked me, what does important mean? Can you tell us what important means? And my answer was, that means that you didn't write your CSS correctly. Now that is perhaps taken a little bit too far, but try to avoid important because now there's no way of overriding that. I'm going to remove important for now. And let's take a look at another example. Let's pop back to our home.razor here. And then in our div here, I'm going to add a class, my class. So now our div has a class. So let's pop back to our CSS here. And let's scroll up just a little bit and let's add our my class here. So what happens if we add the color pink here, like that? Nothing happens because right now we're styling the div. So if we would add some text here, div text, like that, save. And then we can see that the div text now is pink over here. So what about the p tag? Well, if we go back to our CSS here, and I say my class and add the p tag, we can see now that the div text turned black because we're not targeting that one anymore. We're targeting my class and the p tag, and now that turns pink. So this one overrides all the other ones. So why is that? Because this one doesn't have a style. It doesn't have an ID. It does have a class, and it does have an element. So we got 1, 2, and 11 is higher than the other two, which means that is now using that particular style. Now what if I go to home here and I add an ID? So now the div has an ID called my ID. Let's go back to the CSS. Let's add a new style, my ID, like that. And let's copy color. And let's add the color blue here. And boom, we got our div text is blue, but nothing is happening with the p tag here. So if I add a p here as well, we can see that it now turns blue. So what is up with that? Well, it doesn't have a style. It does have an ID. It doesn't have a class, but it does have an element. So that's 101. Which is higher than all of the others, so it now turns blue. And then we have the last one, so let's cover that one as well. So if I go to my home component here, And then on my P tag here, I'm going to add a style equals color yellow. Oh, that's a horrible color choice, but it does turn yellow. So style has the highest specificity, ID comes next, then we have the class, and then just ordinary elements. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. I'm going to add another one down here. I'm going to remove the ID. I'm going to remove the class for now. I'm going to remove the style as well. There we go. Let's save this. There we have another one. And if I go to my CSS here, so if you take a look here, we have P tag 1, div and P 2. So if I would add important to the green one here, it should turn green, because important is more important than all the other specificities. I'm not even sure that that's a real word, but the specificity doesn't matter anymore because we have important. So in this case, this one is overriding this one, it's overriding this one, it's overriding this one. But what would happen if I put important here as well? And it turns red. Because since we have important on both of them, it's now falling back onto the specificity. So in this case, well, 2 is higher than 1. It's going to use the red one. What if we add it to this one? It turns pink, but only the top one, because the bottom one doesn't have a class attached to it. So what about if I add one here? Same thing there. It is falling back onto specificity. So if you're running into the problem that you just added important, but it's still not changing anything, well, chances are that the thing that you're trying to override also has important attached to it, and again falling back onto specificity. So this is a very good example why you shouldn't use important, because you will hit these kinds of pain points. So unless you absolutely, let me repeat that, absolutely needs important, don't use it, because we're always going to fall back onto specificity. So as long as you understand specificity, you're probably not going to have to use important, and also everything is going to be so much clearer. So let me take you through it one more time. The lowest specificity is elements and pseudo elements. The next level is classes, attributes, and pseudo classes. Next one is ID, and the top one is inline styles. And since inline styles are the highest specificity, that means that it's going to override all the other CSS classes you have. And that's why I never use styles, because it's basically going to render your CSS useless. So my suggestion is never use styles, never use important, always rely on specificity. Because if you do, you're not going to hate CSS as much. I hope it has been useful. And as always, like, subscribe, share. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.